We're continuing with Chapter 13 of The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. If information was later found to call it homicide or probable homicide again, we do so. What Gardner didn't mention is that a tentative determination of apparent suicide eliminated the need for a long, complicated murder investigation which could have failed. As Sheriff's investigator Glenn Geitzen later told the Minot Daily News, New York told us Carr was wanted for questioning. I viewed him as a devil worshipper who blew himself away rather than get caught. Yes, a devil worshipper, Geisen said. He found Carr's tarot cards and occult posters with X's and O's, upturned inverted crosses, and snakes on them. And there was more. On February 21st, the day before our post story appeared, a Westchester Sheriff's investigator, Kenneth Zajac, contacted North Dakota concerning Carr. He reported to his superior, Diorio, the day after I called Diorio about Carr's death that he had... That doesn't make any sense. Hold on. The day after I called Diorio about Carr's death that he had contacted the Minot North Dakota Police Department, speaking to Lieutenant Hendrickson, who revealed to me that John C. Carr, date of birth 10/12/46, was in fact found dead in their jurisdiction and that it was being carried as a homicide, possible suicide, but not classified as suicide as of this writing. He further stated that the Ward County Sheriff's Department was investigating the case. He informed me that a Detective Geitzen was working on the case. I then spoke to Deputy Lynn Howe, who related to me that John C. Carr was the victim of a homicide, as yet not classified a suicide, and that their investigation into the case was continuing. He did, however, inform me that they were in possession of written statements from friends of John C. Carr in which John C. Carr allegedly told them he was friends with David Berkowitz and he knew him personally for a long time. Also at this time, this writer, Zajac, was informed that Detective Geitzen had interviewed the psychiatrist who was treating John C. Carr, who listed Carr as a paranoid schizophrenic, and made statements to Detective Geitzen of Carr's problems. Detective Geitzen also ascertained that John C. Carr made during the therapy drawings of David Berkowitz, his home, apartment, etc. Detective Geitzen informed investigator Zajac that he would be sending this writer Zajac via mail copies of the reports, statements, etc. The undersigned asked Detective Geitzen at this point if any other law enforcement agencies had contacted him yet regarding this case, to which he stated that WFAS radio, a Westchester station, had called him. Other members of his department were contacted by the New York Post. After the first statement was made by them, Ward County Sheriff's Department, they were hanging up on these people and not discussing the case further with anyone except the undersigned. Diorio then authorized a telex, which was sent to North Dakota that afternoon, February 21st, addressed to Ward County Deputy Lynn Howe. The message was signed by Zajac for the Westchester Sheriff Thomas Delaney. As per our conversation this date, may this serve to request all information, R.E. John C. Carr, DOA, as of 2/17/78, homicide, your jurisdiction. Request copies of investigation, any photos found in residence revealing any connection or possible connection with New York or residents of New York. Also copies of statements you have from friends. Official letter of request in mail to your jurisdiction this date. Later that same night, as the Post presses Prepare to roll. Another telex was sent to North Dakota from Westchester authorities. This one impounded all of John Carr's effects. The deputy believes family of John C. Carr homicide, your jurisdiction, en route to your jurisdiction in an attempt to regain or take possession of personal property of victim Carr. This property presently impounded by your department for this department. Do not release to family. If any difficulty, please call. Attention, Chief Investigator Diodio or Investigator Zajac immediately. Repeat, do not release property. On February 22nd, with the Post article on the newsstand, Zajac reported to Diodio that he'd done an initial check on Carr's brother, Michael, as I'd recommended 2 days earlier. I advised Diodio that North Dakota contacts told us Michael, 25, was a counselor in the Church of Scientology and was professionally involved in photographics and illustrations and a possible link to the Breslin letters printing style. Zajac then switched to the North Dakota probe and dropped a bombshell. Detective Geitzen stated during this personal conversation with the undersigned that John C. Carr was known to be a member of a satanic occultist group in his jurisdiction that was drug-orientated. He, Carr, made statements to Geitzen that part of the ritual was drinking the leader's urine. The ritual, according to Detective Geitzen, was satanically oriented. Geitzen had been told about the ritual by Carr himself when he was picked up on Minot Street in October 1976. Minot police officer Michael Knoop also heard the urine drinking comment and stated Carr said it was consumed from a chalice. Knoop had uncovered evidence of satanic cult activity in the area while working with undercover drug informants, and Carr was known to the police as a drug dealer. At the time of this incident, Carr, suffering from a drug overdose, had been thrown from a van and found by Geitzen, who was then joined by Knoop. Carr had more than $2,000 in cash strapped to his leg and in his wallet allegedly from drug dealings. Zajac absorbed more details during his conversations with Ward County and Minot officials that day, and fired off another report to Diodio. In it, Zajac stated his professional evaluation of the case. The memo, as usual, was labeled Son of Sam Investigation. It is the opinion of the undersigned that there is a strong possibility that John C. Carr may be involved with David Berkowitz, in addition to the fact that the North Dakota Ward County Sheriff's Department informed this writer at 4:30 p.m. that they had statements from John C. Carr's girlfriend in North Dakota which contained alleged facts that John C. Carr did in fact know David Berkowitz. Also, statements from males verify the fact that John C. Carr knew David Berkowitz personally. The investigation was at this stage at the moment. The Post article was being discredited by authorities in New York City and Westchester. On February 23rd, with the story we'd put together dead and buried, Zajac wrote, Detective Geitzen, while speaking to Zajac via telephone, stated that Linda R. O'Connor made a statement that during John C. Carr's trips in and out of North Dakota, he made statements to her that he knew the police were looking for him in connection with David Berkowitz, and he, Carr, was extremely paranoid. Detective Geitzen then stated that Linda R. O'Connor, you knew that he was being looked for by the police and yet you still harbored him. Do you realize that is a crime? She stated. I had no knowledge that he was a criminal, so I was not bound by that law. Carr stated to Linda that the cops were hot on his trail and he had to leave New York for a while, but he would contact her. On February 24th, Ward County officers interviewed Jeffrey Slowat, an airman and former roommate of Carr's. The report said in part, during the period of them being roommates, John C. Carr acted in strange ways, always talking of Berkowitz and stating they were friends. One of the strange ways Carr acted, another report said, was to cover $10 bills with mayonnaise and eat them. On February 27th, Ward County investigator Glenn Geitzen wrote up another report on an interview with Slowat. In part, it said, Carr, talked a lot of Berkowitz, a lot of Son of Sam, and talked about his dog Berkowitz had shot. When asked for particular details, Jeffrey said it was mostly small talk until after the dog was shot. The Carr dog was shot in April. Berkowitz was arrested in August. According to Slowat, Carr was talking about Berkowitz even before April, many months before his arrest as Son of Sam. The Carr family said they'd never even heard of Berkowitz until June, when the Casadas in New Rochelle named him as a suspect in the wounding of the Carr family's dog in Yonkers. Jeffrey was instrumental in committing John in a mental institution. When asked why he had done that, he stated, "All the time he lived with me, he acted very crazy," he stated. John would run around beating on the walls, breaking glass, and screaming something that was incoherent. John conversed quite often with Abraham Lincoln through a picture, carrying on lengthy conversations with the past president. He would write all over the walls the letters XXO and XOX, with an inverted cross beneath as drawn by Geitzen later. He would also write, "There's only 32 days in a month, so to hell." Carr, the authorities also determined, owned several guns. In total, police in North Dakota amassed information indicating that Carr knew Berkowitz, in contrast to the official story put forth in New York, was involved in a satanic cult. New police in New York were looking for him and fled, and used and dealt drugs and owned weapons, including handguns. A clear picture of Carr's deteriorated mental state also emerged from the interviews, as did the fact that he closely resembled Son of Sam composite sketch released after the Lomino Damasi attack, a time police established Carr was in New York. And nothing happened. Berkowitz was allowed to plead guilty as a lone killer. There wasn't even a follow-up investigation as emphasized by the North Dakota police. In late August 1979, my conversations continued with Jeff Neese, Gardner, and Knoop. One night, while Neese listened in on an extension in the sheriff's department, I asked Gardner for the names of people he'd learned were associated with John Carr. The deputy reached into a file and went down a list of names, most of whom were from North Dakota. He then came to another name. "The guy's supposed to be from New York," he said. "Okay, that's of interest. Who is it?" "It's this guy named Reeve Rockman," Gardner replied, and then prepared to continue with his list. "Reeve Rockman? Yeah, we don't have much on this dude, just that he's out here with Carr in October of '76, just after John got the boot from the Air Force and went on a druggie binge." "What else?" "Nothing much. Rockman showed up out here, and John went back to New York with him about October 25th of '76. "I see. Who the hell is he? You know him." "You know him?" Gardner asked. "I don't know any more. I thought he was a figment of somebody's imagination. I hadn't spoken to Bronx homicide detective Hank Sinodi since the week after the aborted Good Friday stakeout in Untermeyer Park, and it wasn't easy for me to make the call. Hank, you remember your boy Rockman, Veronica Lucan's pride and joy? Well, it seems he managed to get himself to North Dakota to visit his buddy John Wheaties." "No shit," Sinodi exulted. "I told you he was involved, but you didn't want to believe it. I knew about his 2 names and addresses, and I always said he was curious, but I couldn't buy the rest of Lucan's story, and neither could Jim," I explained. "Look, what's done is done. The important thing is that he's a live wire again. He always was with me," Hank chuckled. "Okay, I had that coming. I told Sinodi about the North Dakota information and said I was flying to Minot as soon as possible. Not without me, you aren't, Hank insisted. I've got the interviews lined up, and I've got to talk to these friends of Carr. They're expecting me over Labor Day weekend. I've got a flight that Friday before. Will you let me talk to this gardener? Hank asked. I gave Sonodi the deputy's number and began preparing for the trips. I would be going alone. John Ungaro, the Gannett paper's executive editor, authorized my expenses, but not Jim Midigar. And Midigar, who was strapped for cash because of his legal problems, couldn't afford to go on his own. His trial date was also approaching, and he was occupied with his defense. A third consideration was that Jim remained openly critical of both Sonodi and Lucan. I think all the stuff about Carr is great, he said, and you can bet it's on target. But this Rockman thing, for all I know, Lucan called up out there a year ago, and Gardner just forgets the information came that way. No, he knows right where it came from. Jim was starting to feel that his input was being backburnered, and he was dismayed that I'd reached out for Sonodi again. He also resented that Gannett declined to underwrite his trip, although it was merely an economic decision. But Jim still remembered the first series, published in March, when the editors kept his byline off the articles because of his arrest. I don't like what's going on, he said. I don't blame you, but it seems like things are starting to get out of hand. You don't expect me to stay home, do you? Of course not. You dug it up anyway. I hope everything goes great out there. Just call me from Minot and let me know what the hell is happening, will you? You got it. As I drove to LaGuardia Airport on August 31st, I was unaware of a violent event that had recently happened in Queens. Shortly after the Moskowitz article was published, when itself came on the heels of Berkowitz's throat-slashing, a rotund young man named Howard Weiss was shot to death in his Flushing apartment. Months later, Weiss's close male companion, his homosexual lover, police say, would be arrested for the killing. His name was Rodriguez. The relevancy of this murder would increase when it became known that Weiss was a friend of David Berkowitz. Weiss, Berkowitz, and a former Yonkers police officer I will call Peter Shane all belonged to a police auxiliary fire rescue unit in the Bronx in 1971 before Berkowitz joined the Army. Shane, in applying for the Yonkers police position in 1973, listed Weiss as a reference. He would later acknowledge that he gave Weiss 2 handguns in the spring of 1979, shortly before Weiss's murder. Shane and Berkowitz each owned .44 Bulldog revolvers, and although sources said Weiss also did, none was found in his apartment. But detectives working the Weiss case told a reporter that most of Weiss's guns were recovered. The implication was evident. Weiss owned more guns. Both Weiss and Shane held peace officer status, Shane as a Yonkers cop and Weiss as a part-time investigator for a Bronx child welfare agency. Thus, firearms registration certificates through which their gun ownership could be traced weren't available. Shane knew Wheat Carr, sister of John and Michael, from her own post as a civilian dispatcher with the Yonkers Police Department. Therefore, Shane provided a direct link between Weiss, Berkowitz, and members of the Carr family, and Shane's tie to Berkowitz wasn't an old one. It would be established that Shane, Berkowitz, and Weiss all attended the Maryland wedding of another friend shortly before the Son of Sam killings began. There were movies of the wedding reception. They were there. I'd learned from Queens Assistant District Attorney Herb Leifer. Shane, for his part, wouldn't acknowledge his friendship with Wheat Carr and Weiss, but said he didn't work with Berkowitz in the auxiliary unit yet, as Leifer would say. Those guys were all at the wedding, and Shane and Weiss were friends, and so were Weiss and Berkowitz. Reporter Dan Diamond later quoted a source as telling him, flat out, that Shane and Weiss were both involved in the cult with Berkowitz. They are all psychos who are intrigued by blood and death. It's part of their life, the source stated. He added that the three men, as well as the other cult members, were fire buffs, and explained that this common bond influenced their cult activities, some of which involved arson. Years later, a friend of Berkowitz's would supply